There was a book on addiction and recovery published in 1996, which coined for the first time the phrase trust the process, which I'm sure is a phrase that you're all familiar with. It's ubiquitous now in our culture, and it speaks of the idea of that even if things seem to have not been going well or not going our way, that if we have faith in the process that we're involved in, then it'll turn out okay in the end. I was at my first ever Saints football game yesterday. My daughter, Autumn, had been dying to go, so we went along and they went 2-0 up, and eventually they ended up tragically with a draw. They were totally robbed. And I think if they had just trusted the process, it probably wouldn't have worked. So this doesn't work in all circumstances. But it was what was supposed to be happening with God's relationship to his people in Israel. And I have to say, a lot of the time in our journey of faith, when we're looking to walk through the world with God, trusting the process is a massive part of it. And even further than that, sometimes the process or the journey that we're on with God, it is the point rather than the destination. And that's where we find the children of Israel in Exodus 16. But there's a lot that they need to learn in order to get that. Now, where are we coming from? Last week we had the dramatic escape where God released, delivered, rescued the children of Israel from Egypt and from under the yoke of slavery via various miracles, not least the parting of the Red Sea. And now they're on the other side and they're headed towards the land flowing with milk and honey that they're going to gain. But it's in a sense now that the real story starts, or that the real journey starts, and that the tests begin. I've only picked one test to look at. There are 3 tests, and this is the one in the middle because it's illustrative of what they're all doing. But it's a bit like any great story. It's only once you're sort of released from the immediate threat of danger that you find there's another one just around the corner. So they've gotten out of slavery and now they're very much confronting starvation and wondering if they're even going to survive. Think of all the great stories that you know and love. I love the Lord of the Rings series, and it's only once Frodo leaves the Shire and accepts the call to go and try and get rid of the ring that he encounters hordes of orcs on the way there, and that even his mentor, he thinks he's died. And it's a classic thing because we learn about the power and the process of what it is to come up against struggle and to prevail, and the way that changes a person, the struggle. And I think that's what God is doing here. So what I want to look at briefly this morning is, I think in this chapter in 16, there are 3 perspectives that we find. I want to try and look at what it must feel like, or what the process is from the human perspective for the children of Israel, and by extension for us, what it's like to be in this process of a journey of faith with God. And then secondly, what is happening from God's perspective in this chapter. And lastly, and most briefly, the perspective of future generations. The human perspective, God's perspective, and future generations. What's going on with the humans? Well, they're very human, aren't they? The children of Israel. They get out and they start to get a bit hungry, and they said, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There was round pots of meat and all the food we wanted, but you have brought us into this desert to starve the entire assembly." So what do? They do the most human thing of all. They take what is in front of them, which is Moses and Aaron, what they can see, and they say, "You are the problem. This is your fault." They've just seen God deliver them dramatically from slavery. Did you notice as well that they did not have a great life when they were in Egypt? They were really struggling. It's implausible that anyone in the ancient system of slavery would have had plentiful pots of meat. Meat was a delicacy in the ancient world. It still is in a lot of poverty-stricken parts of the world today. And so they're interpreting everything through the lens of their current misery, which we can all do on a bad day. But they're doing this in a huge scale. And they're all grumbling. And I wonder if you've ever wondered, because I did when I was reading this story this week, what is the point in the manna story? You know, if God is who he is, and he's just parted the Red Sea, and he's just drowned all their enemies, and He's done something completely miraculous. Why didn't he just fill their bellies? Why didn't he just magic a banquet that they were all able to eat from there and then? What is the point in this process? Because the Lord says the people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. And in this way, I'll test them. On the 6th day, they're to prepare what they bring in. It'll be twice as much so that they'll get the Sabbath. What's with this process? Well, there's that word again. Think about where they are in their mindset. They have just come from being under the boot of a tyrannical oppressor who saw them as nothing but commodities in his empire and in his machine to keep making him more money and more prosperity. They would have been given whatever rations were deemed appropriate by their overseers and their slave masters. Now, have you ever seen or experienced or even read about when somebody comes, even in our modern day, from a scarcity situation? Maybe they were reared in extreme poverty or complete parental neglect. And then they go into a system, or maybe they're adopted into a good family who takes care of them and there's always plenty of food on the table. What's their instinctive reaction whenever food comes out? To eat as much as they can there and then, to grab it, maybe to hoard it and store it in their bedroom, because that's the way their brain has unfortunately and tragically been wired to survive. Whenever food appears, they need to get it, because they're living in a survival mindset. And so this process is about showing them, God is saying, I'm going to teach you to learn to live in a relationship with someone who takes care of you, not in a tyrannical way, but in a loving way. I need to start to help your brains and your minds and your souls rework themselves into a situation where there is always going to be a God who will provide what you need. There's going to be someone overseeing you who is actually concerned for you. And there's always going to be enough. But it's only through them walking through this process of going out and finding that there's enough. And in the passage Aileen read for us, there was people gathering too much, and then it turned out they had just enough. And people who thought maybe they didn't gather quite enough, and it turned out that there was just enough, because that was the point in the process. And have you ever wondered about the fact that they were to gather 2 amounts on the 6th day? Now, we know later on the law comes and the Sabbath day is important and it's part of the religious apparatus of their belief. But why do you think this is important for a people who've just come from slavery? Think about it. They existed, as any slaves in modern slavery do, they existed to work. They existed to be commodities for the person who effectively owned them. And so, this day that is sacred and sanctified is to communicate to them, not only are you now in a loving relationship with God who will provide for what you need, but you are also no longer a commodity. You do not exist. You were not made. You are not formed just to work and to produce labor and capital for somebody else's benefit. You can take a day off. Okay? You don't need to go out and try and survive on that day. Get enough for the 2 days. Seems to be the point of it. Now, what does this mean for us? Because we're not in that wilderness, and we're not where they are, and we haven't just emerged from a situation of slavery, or have we? Because I think where this maps onto our lives and experience is that slavery is not just being in chains and having to go and make bricks for somebody else. Especially as it gets developed through the rest of the Bible and the New Testament, slavery is actually just being bound to anything that limits our control and our freedom, even in our thinking. It's possible to have a slavery mindset even though nobody is coming and putting any chains on us. Think about our culture today. And it goes from the top all the way down. Think about the person who is CEO of many companies. And there's no way that they could possibly spend all the money they've ever made. But they need to keep going and keep amassing wealth and keep creating more status, because they can't get out of it. They can't stop. They don't know who they are if they don't stop doing that. Think about the prevalence of addictions, whether that is substances or gambling or whatever it is. It's people, nobody's telling them that they have to do that. It doesn't take a pharaoh or a tyrant of that kind. A slavery mindset could even be a pattern of thinking, that we feel I need to think in that way, whether that's purely of our neighbors or whether that's really purely of ourselves. But somehow we're connected and we identify with thinking in that way, and it's a cycle that we struggle to break, and it's a form of slavery. It's possible to have a slavery mindset even though we are technically free. And the beauty of what we see as this picture in the Bible develops is God wishes for all his people to be free of any kind of slavery. You don't need to be bound to whether it's an addiction or a pattern of thinking or even a lifestyle or a collection of relations. There's nothing that can be put on you that is dragging you down and is negative and is less than the fullness of life that Christ died to give us, that you don't have to accept, that God can't do something about. And maybe for us this morning, it's just hearing that call of God to say, see that part of your life where you feel completely stuck? Maybe it's the invitation of God to move out past it because it's not his best for you and it's not actually what he has for you. And maybe you'll try and you'll fail, because I want to give you some hope. Because these stories are set in the series of a bunch of tests, and the people of Israel do fail. And every time God returns and he comes back to them and he says, I'm going to set up the game, the dice, whatever again, and let's try again. Because learning and processing and learning a new way, a freedom mindset, if you like, it does take practice. And it takes knocks and falling down and failing and getting up and trying again. And God is intensely aware of that, and he does that through his patience and with his people. So from a human perspective, the place they've just come from and all the trauma that they've experienced, it's important for them to enter a new process where they'll learn that they're being provided for by someone who's good and who loves them, and also that they don't have to have that slave mindset anymore. And certainly that they don't just exist for someone else's benefit, that they are liberated in order to be who God has called them to be. And then the way God sort of comes down and condescends and what he gives and brings from his perspective, it says in verse 7, in the morning you will see the glory of the Lord, because he's heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us? You will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning. This is an amazing passage, because the glory of the Lord might feel like something that none of us can really get a handle on, and we're not sure what it is. But here it's linked to the absolute substance of what God is able to do for his people. If you like, God in this passage condescends and comes down in order to sort out the problems that the people have, the immediate problems in front of them. Now, if you look at the word glory as it's developed all through the Bible, it's the same word as kind of weightiness. What it means when it says that God is glorious is that he's substantial, that he's not flighty, that he has a real depth and substance and weight to him, that people are actually able to put their hope in him. And you see how his glory, what people are going to see, is that this is a God you can actually depend on. This is not Pharaoh, who said he will do one thing and then will do another and keeps changing his mind. This is God. He actually controls nature. He actually has created everything in the world that you see, and so from that creation he will provide what it is you need to survive. He's the real deal. He's substantial. He's glorious. It's another way to think of the word glorious, that God is substantial. And I think what God is trying to do is to get that substance into his people. That seems to be the approach that he's taking. And again, he knows that is only going to happen by a process. Now, you might think that's a bit of a reach because it doesn't say that that's what the glory of the Lord is doing in this passage, but it did in the passage that I read right at the start of the service from Isaiah 62. And we know that from the New Testament, that as the people of God, we are being prepared for a crown of glory. That's the whole idea, something really substantial. But to get to that point of being people who reflect God, because we're people of depth and substance and even have something of the gloriousness of God within us, that is going to take a process that is often difficult. You see, don't confuse what I said about God wanting to set us free and for us to live free from whatever it is that keeps us in bondage and enslaved. That does not mean ease and comfort all the time. That's a distortion of what gets offered in the Bible. It's rather something deeper and more profound than that. It is the experience of walking through God through difficulty, want, need, suffering, hard times, and that through God's Spirit shaping us and changing us and making us into substantial people. And that's not easy, and nobody would want to sign up for this. Honestly, I wish that were not the law of the universe and how God makes us more substantial and deeper people. But it is. And when you've come through that, you always know it was worth it. I remember when I think it was the first lockdown that hit, and all the gyms closed, and I was thinking, what am I going to do for exercise? And I thought, well, I need to really make up for the gyms being closed. So I started doing lots of new things, running way more than I ever did, and skipping and all the rest of it. Anyway, I got really bad shin splints, and which is like the tendons behind your shin. It's gross. I don't want to tell you too much about it. But the wee fibers start to tear away, and it's really painful. You can't run. I kept on running through it thinking it'll be fine. Typical man, you know. But that took ages to heal. I went to, I think, 2 or 3 different physiotherapists. I even went to the doctor. I thought I was going to need surgery. And it took over a year. And finally, through doing a combination of exercises and a little bit of needling or of some kind, it eventually healed. But there were times in that where I thought, these are never going to heal and I'm never going to be able to run again. And I was like the children of Israel. I was complaining. It was hard. But through that process, I learned about that part of my physiology and how important it is to actually take care of it and not be so intense and double my running in 1 week and all of that. I wish it didn't take what it did in order for me to learn that. But I did learn that through the process. And I do have something better now because I've got more, sense for a start, a little bit more sense anyway, but an understanding of how that works that I wouldn't have had otherwise. We had to close the church not long after I came here. I don't think any of us wanted that. I don't think any of us would have chosen that. I don't know if you think that I'm so holy and sanctimonious that I never asked God what on earth he was doing, asking me to come into ministry and just for everything to get shut down. And what was the point in that? But you know, when I first came, I thought maybe within 5 years we'll get some multimedia, some live streaming, get our services out there on the internet. It happened within a year because we were forced to, because we went through this difficult, horrible, uncomfortable process. And lots of things about it were painful, but some good things came out of it. And now we're speaking to people on the internet today we would never have connected with otherwise. And you will have your own stories like that. Things that you have gone through, you would never have chosen them, but through them, God worked with you. And you can look back and see, I grew through that. That was difficult and painful, but that changed me for the better. And that's not inevitable. Not everyone does. But that's the promise and the hope and the beauty of being on this journey with God, is when you do hit those wilderness periods, those rough times, that you are promised and assured that you will grow with God through that, and you will become more substantial. You become a weightier person. Let me ask you the counterfactual. Have you ever met someone who whether metaphorically or literally, was born with a silver spoon in their mouth, and they really have not had much that they've had to endure through life. How deep are they? How dependable are they if you were in a crisis? What are they like to spend time with? They're not substantial. You know that. They're not substantial. There is something incontrovertible about the fact that the best people that we all know, that we admire, have had enormous struggles to overcome. It does something within one's soul, and combined with being in relationship with God through that, prepares us for the weight of glory and the glory of God itself, which he promises to his followers. I think that's what God is doing from his perspective in this little wilderness journey. And thirdly, lastly, most briefly, is just the perspective from future generations. Take an omer of manna, the Lord said, and keep it for generations to come, so they can see the bread that I gave you to eat in the wilderness when I brought you out of Egypt. See, the reason we're here this morning is because people have recorded their experience and their stories of struggle through faith, and they kept it, and they listened to that instruction, because people tend to forget. And they tend to forget the difficult parts, and they tend to sometimes not even record the difficult parts. They just look back and say, well, there were some hard times, but it was generally very good, and I had a nice life and whatnot. And the powerful and beautiful thing about the biblical witness is it just doesn't skip over anything. It lets you see these people when they are at their most miserable, most miserly, when they're throwing their toys out of the pram, when they're intransigent and difficult, when they're questioning God and wondering what he's even trying to do with them. And it's all recorded so that we can see that despite that and through that, God worked with them, and God had a plan and had somewhere he was wanting to take them, so that we would be here today and there would still be a witness of faith. The gospel, the good news, is essentially that God has done something in history and worked with people, and that he's changed lives as a result. In a sense, all the Gospels about Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that's what they are, is people recording that God showed up and did something and changed their lives and their hearts, and it was better and it made a difference, and they are now connected to him, and they have hope for the future of this world because of all these things that he has done. That is the gospel in a nutshell. But it only happens because people record what God has actually done. And there's something essential to the nature of what we do in faith, that we do record it, that we do. Well, maybe for you it's taking time to reflect. Maybe you're not into meditation, maybe it's just thinking about it for 5 minutes. What has God done in my life? Or if you're not at that point and you don't recognize those things, but they sound attractive, and you're wondering, could that be something? Could there be something in that for me? Is to be honest and say to God, I want to be part of the people who have a story to tell, that you did something in their life, that you call out to him and you expect him to show up and to do something and make a difference in your life, so that you might be able to record it. Because future generations depend on it. God has come into our world in Jesus, and he has assumed our difficulty, our weakness, all the stuff the children of Israel were complaining about. Jesus took it on himself. And then he does what they don't have to do. God comes through and rescues the people in this instance. Jesus has no one to rescue him when he dies on a cross instead of the people that put him there. That is the most amazing event that has ever happened in history. Even secular historians will in large part agree to that. It fundamentally changed the world, whether we like it or not. It's recorded so that future people will be able to say, that is a God who is in a process with people, who doesn't give up on them, who wants to put something of his own substance and weightiness and glory within people. And he does that by coming and meeting them exactly where they are and providing what they need. And he will do that for you and for me. May God bless his word to us this morning. Amen.